Hi. Um, since I'm in the mood to make some videos recently, I wanted to keep reading this book to you. It's Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. I've been wanting to read this recently. I kind of talked about it in my last video, but I've been going through a bunch of stuff and I've kind of just been doing a whole lot of nothing. So I want to start doing a little bit of something. So I'm going to read this with you just a little bit. Just for a little bit. I hope you fall asleep, because reading is boring. Reading keeps me awake because I want to keep reading the next line. Morse code is like speech. Everyone has a different voice. In the Second World War, the British assembled thousands of so-called interceptors, mostly women, whose job it was to tune in every day and night to the radio broadcasts of various divisions of the German military. The Germans were, of course, broadcasting in code, so at least in the early part of the war, the British couldn't understand what was being said. But that didn't necessarily matter, because before long, just by listening to the cadence of the transmission, the interceptors began to pick up on the individual fists of the German operators. And by doing so, they knew something nearly as important, which was who was doing the sending. If you listened to the same call signs over a certain period, you would begin to recognize that there were, say, 3 or 4 different operators in that unit, working on a shift system, each with his own characteristics, says Nigel West, a British military historian. And invariably, quite apart from the text, there would be the preambles and the illicit exchanges. How are you today? How's the girlfriend? What's the weather like in Munich? So you fill out a little card on which you write down all of that kind of information, and pretty soon you have a kind of relationship with that person. The interceptors came up with the descriptions of the fists and styles of the operators they were following. They assigned them names and assembled elaborate profiles of their personalities. After they identified the person who was sending the message, the interceptors would then locate their signal, so now they knew something more. They knew who was where. West goes on. The interceptors had such a good handle on the transmitting characteristics of the German radio operators that they would literally follow them around Europe, wherever they were. That was extraordinarily valuable in constructing an order of battle, which is a diagram of what the individual military units in the field are doing and what their location is. If a particular radio operator was with a particular unit and transmitting from Florence, and then 3 weeks later you recognize that same operator, only this time he was in Linz, then you could assume that that particular unit had moved from northern Italy to the Eastern Front. Or you would know that a particular operator was with a tank repair unit and he always came up on the air every day at 12 o'clock. But now after a big battle he's coming up at 12, 4 in the afternoon, and 7 in the evening. So you can assume that the unit has a lot of work going on. And in a moment of crisis, when someone very high up asks, can you really be absolutely certain that this particular... Wow, that is something in German. In parentheses it says German Air Force Squadron is outside of Tobruk and not in Italy. You can answer, yes, that was Oscar, we're absolutely sure. The key thing about fists is that they emerge naturally. Radio operators don't deliberately try to sound distinctive. They simply end up sounding distinctive because some part of their personality appears to express itself automatically and unconsciously in the way they work the Morse code keys. The The other thing about a fist is that it reveals itself in even the smallest sample of Morse code. We have to listen to only a few characters to pick out an individual's pattern. It doesn't change or disappear for stretches or show up only in certain words or phrases. That's why the British interceptors would listen to just a few bursts and say with absolute certainty, "It's Oscar," which means that yes, his unit is now definitely outside of Tobruk. An operator's fist is stable. What Gottman is saying is that a relationship between two people has a fist as well, a distinctive signature that arises naturally and automatically. That is why a marriage can be read and decoded so easily, because some key part of human activity, whether it is something as simple as pounding out a Morse code message or as complex as being married to someone, has an identifiable and stable pattern. Predicting divorce, like tracking Morse code operators, is pattern recognition. People are in one of two states in a relationship, Gottman went on. The first is what I call a positive sentiment override, where positive emotion overrides irritability. It's like a buffer. Their spouse will do something bad and they'll say, "Oh, he's just in a crummy mood." Or they can be in a negative sentiment override, so that even a relatively neutral thing that a partner says gets perceived as negative. In the negative sentiment override, people draw lasting conclusions about each other. If their spouse does something positive, it's a selfish person doing a positive thing. It's really hard to change those states, and those states determine whether, when one party tries to repair things, the other party sees that as repair or hostile manipulation. For example, I'm talking with my wife. She says, "Will you shut up and let me finish?" In positive sentiment override, I say, "Sorry, go ahead." I'm not very happy, but I recognize the repair. In negative sentiment override, I say, "To hell with you, I'm not getting a chance to finish either. You're such a bitch. You remind me of your mother." Goodness. As he was talking, Gottman drew a graph on a piece of paper that looked a lot like a chart of the ups and downs of the stock market over the course of a typical day. What he does, he explains, is track the ups and downs of couples' level of positive and negative emotion, and he's found that it doesn't take very long to figure out which way the line on the graph is going. Some go up, some go down, but once they start going down toward negative emotion, 94% will continue going down. They start in a bad course and they can't correct it. I don't think of this as just a slice in time. It's an indication of how they view their whole relationship. The importance of content. Let's dig a little deeper into the secret of Gottman's success rate. Gottman has divorced. Why can't I read? It's because I don't read enough. Gottman has discovered that marriages have distinctive signatures, and we can find that signature by collecting very detailed emotional information from the interaction of a couple. But there's something else that is very interesting about Gottman's system, and that is the way in which he manages to simplify the task of prediction. I hadn't realized how much of an issue this was until I tried thin slicing couples myself. I got one of Gottman's tapes, which had on it 10 3-minute clips of different couples talking. Half the couples I told split up at some point in the 15 years after their discussion was filmed. Half were still together. Could I guess which was which? I was pretty confident that I could, but I was wrong. I was terrible at it. I answered 5 correctly, which is to say that I would have done just as well by flipping a coin. My difficulty arose from the fact that the clips were utterly overwhelming. The husband would say something guarded, the wife would respond quietly, some fleeting emotion would flash across her face. He would start to say something and then stop. She would scowl. He would laugh. Someone would mutter something. Someone would frown. I would rewind the tape and look at it again, and I would get still more information. I'd see a little trace of a smile, or I'd pick up a slight change in tone. It was all too much. In my head, I was frantically trying to determine the ratios of positive emotion to negative emotion, but what counted as positive and what counted as negative? I knew from Susan and Bill that a lot of what looked positive was actually negative. And I also knew that there were no fewer than 20 separate emotional states on this SPAF chart. Have you ever tried to keep track of 20 different emotions simultaneously? Now, granted, I'm not a marriage counselor, but That same tape has been given to almost 200 marital therapists, marital researchers, pastoral counselors, and graduate students in clinical psychology, as well as newlyweds, people who are recently divorced, and people who have been happily married for a long time. In other words, almost 200 people who know a good deal more about marriage than I do, and none of them was any better than I was. The group as a whole guessed right 53.8% of the time, which is just above chance. The fact that there was a pattern didn't much matter. There were so many other things going on so quickly in those 3 minutes that we couldn't find the pattern. Gottman, however, doesn't have this problem. He's gotten so good at thin slicing marriages that he says he can be in a restaurant and eavesdrop on a couple one table over and get a pretty good sense of whether they need to start thinking about hiring lawyers and dividing up custody of the children. How does he do it? He has figured out that he doesn't need to pay attention to everything that happens. I was overwhelmed by the task of counting negativity because everywhere I looked I saw negative emotions. Gottman is far more selective. He has found that he can find out much of what he needs to know just by focusing on what he calls the 4 horsemen: defensiveness, stonewalling, criticism, and contempt. If Gottman observes one or both partners in a marriage showing contempt toward each other, he considers it the single most important sign that the marriage is in trouble. You would think that criticism would be the worst, Gottman says, but criticism is a global condemnation of a person's character. Yet contempt is qualitatively different from criticism. With criticism, I might say to my wife, "You never listen, you're really selfish and insensitive." Well, she's going to respond defensively to that. It's not very good for our problem-solving interaction. But if I speak from a superior plane, it's far more damaging. Contempt is any statement made from a higher level. A lot of the time, it's an insult. You're a bitch, you're scum. It's trying to put that person on a lower plane than you. It's hierarchical. I know this word. Hierarchy, but hierarchically. I'm smart. I swear. Gottman has found, in fact, that the presence of contempt in a marriage can even predict such things as how many colds a husband or wife gets. In other words, having someone you love express contempt towards you is so stressful that it begins to affect the functioning of your immune system. Contempt is closely related to disgust, and what disgust and contempt are about is completely rejecting and excluding someone from the community. The big gender difference with negative emotions is that women are more critical, and men are more likely to stonewall. We find that women start talking about a problem, and men get irritated and turn away, and the women get more critical, and it becomes a circle. But there isn't any gender difference when it comes to contempt, not at all. Contempt is special. If you can measure contempt, then all of a sudden you don't need to know every detail of the couple's relationship. I think that this is the way that our unconscious works. When we leap to a decision or have a hunch, our unconscious is doing what John Gottman does. It's sifting through the situation in front of us, throwing out all that is irrelevant while we zero in on what really matters. And the truth is that our unconscious is really good at this, to the point where thin slicing often delivers a better answer than more deliberate and exhaustive ways of thinking. The secrets of the bedroom. Imagine that you're considering me for a job. You've seen my resume and think I have the necessary credentials. But you want to know whether I'm the right fit for your organization. Am I a hard worker? Am I honest? Am I open to new ideas? In order to answer those questions about my personality, your boss gives you 2 options. The first is to meet with me twice a week for a year, to have lunch or dinner, or go to a movie with me, to the point where you become one of my closest friends. Your boss is quite demanding. The second option is to drop by my house when I'm not there and spend half an hour or so looking around. Which would you choose? The seemingly obvious answer that you should take the first option, the thick slice. the more time you spend with me, the more information you gather, the better off you are, right? I hope by now that you're at least a little bit skeptical of that approach. Sure enough, as the psychologist Samuel Gosling has shown, judging people's personalities is a really good example of how surprisingly effective thin slicing can be. Gosling began his experiment by doing personality workup on 80 college students. For this, he used what is called the Big Five Inventory, a highly respected multi-item questionnaire that measures people across 5 dimensions. Extroversion. Are you sociable? Or retiring, fun-loving or reserved? Agreeableness. Are you trusting or suspicious, helpful or uncooperative? Conscientiousness. Are you organized or disorganized, self-disciplined or weak-willed? Emotional stability. Are you worried or calm, insecure or secure? Openness to new experiences. Are you imaginative or down-to-earth, independent or conforming? Then Gosling had close friends of those 80 students fill out the same questionnaire. When our friends rank us on the Big Five, Gosling wanted to know how closely do they come to the truth. The answer is not surprisingly that our friends can describe us fairly accurately. They have a thick slice of experience with us, and that translates to a real sense of who we are. Then Gosling repeated the process, but this time he didn't call on those close friends. He used total strangers who had never even met the students they were judging. All they saw were their dorm rooms. He gave his raters clipboards and told them they had 15 minutes to look around and answer a series of basic questions about the occupant of the room. On a scale of 1 to 5, does the inhabitant of this room seem to be the kind of person who is talkative, tends to find fault with others, does a thorough job, is original, is reserved, is helpful and unselfish with others, and so on? I was trying to study everyday impressions, Gosling says, so I was quite careful not to tell my subjects what to do. I just said, here's your questionnaire, go into the room, drink it in. I was just trying to look at intuitive judgment processes. How did they do? The dorm room observers weren't nearly as good as friends in measuring extroversion. If you want to know how animated and talkative and outgoing someone is, clearly you have to meet him or her in person. The friends also did slightly better than the dorm room visitors at accurately estimating agreeableness, how helpful and trusting someone is. I think that also makes sense. But on the remaining 3 traits of the Big Five, the strangers with the clipboards came out on top. They were more accurate at measuring conscientiousness, and they were more accurate on predicting both the students' emotional stability and their openness to new experiences. On balance, then, the strangers ended up doing a much better job. What this suggests is that it's quite possible for people to have never met us and who have spent only 20 minutes thinking about us to come up to a better understanding of who we are than the people who have known us for years. Forget the endless getting to know meetings and lunches, then. If you want to get a good idea of whether I'd make a good employee, drop by my house one day and take a look around. If you are like most people, I imagine that you find Gosling's conclusions quite incredible. But the truth is that they shouldn't be. Not after the lessons of John Gottman. This is just another example of thin slicing. The observers were looking at the students' most personal belongings, and our personal belongings contain a wealth of very telling information. Gosling says, for example, that a person's bedroom gives 3 kinds of clues to his or her personality. There are, first of all, identity claims, which are deliberate expressions of how we would like to be seen by the world, a framed copy of a magna cum laude degree from Harvard. I said manga instead of magna. I'm a weeb. Then there is behavioral residue, which is defined as the inadvertent clues we leave behind. Dirty laundry on the floor, for instance, or an alphabetized CD collection. Finally, there are thoughts and feelings regulators, which are changes we make to our most personal spaces to affect the way we feel when we inhabit them. A scented candle in the corner, for example, or a pile of artfully placed decorative pillows on the bed. If you see alphabetized CDs, a Harvard diploma on the wall, incense on the side table, and laundry neatly stacked in a hamper, you know certain aspects about that individual's personality instantly, in a way that you might not be able to grasp if all you ever do is spend time with him or her directly. Anyone who has ever scanned the bookshelves of a new girlfriend or boyfriend or peeked inside his or her medicine cabinet understands this implicitly. You can learn as much or more from one glance at a private space as you can from hours of exposure to a public face. Just as important, though, it's important you don't have... Just as important, though, is the information you don't have when you look through someone's belongings. What you avoid when you don't meet someone face to face are all the confusing and complicated and ultimately irrelevant pieces of information that can serve to screw up your judgment. Most of us have difficulty believing that a 275-pound football lineman could have a lively and discerning intellect. We just can't get past the stereotype of the dumb jock. If all we saw of that person was his bookshelf or the art on his walls, we wouldn't have that same problem. What people say about themselves can also be very confusing, for the simple reason that most of us aren't very objective about ourselves. That's why, when we measure personality, we don't just ask people point blank what they think they're like. We give them a questionnaire like the Big Five inventory, carefully designed to elicit telling responses. That's also why Gottman doesn't waste any time asking husbands and wives point-blank questions about the state of their marriage. They might lie or feel awkward, or, more important, they might not know the truth. They may be so deeply mired, or so happily ensconced. I've never seen that word. Ensconced. In their relationship that they have no perspective on how it works. Couples simply aren't aware of how they sound. Says Sybil Currer. Has an accent. I have to end the video soon. The video stopped recording. But I think that I can end right there anyways. I really like this book. Some of it is kind of silly, but I mean, I don't know. I'm probably going to keep reading, but I'm glad that I could read to you for right now. Enjoy the rest of your night.